This morning's discussion about kind of collecting and the art of collecting, and there was questions there at the end about things coming in and out of collections. And it's interesting to look at the history of the Ye collection and when things did leave and trying to trace that. There are stories that come up in kind of personal things that Max talks about and Yetong talks about. And also looking, as we were doing early on, trying to find seals and evidence of paintings that left the collection and went elsewhere. And certainly there are a number of really interesting examples of things leaving the collection during the war with Japan, and a major Huang Tingjian calligraphy now in the Hosokawa collection, a registered piece in Japan, that left the collection without money exchanging hands in the 1930s. And then a number of pieces leaving the collection between 1949 and the early 50s, when Ye Gongchuo was living in Hong Kong and had no money and was selling things, and a lot of those things went through Zhang Daqian and ended up in the Crawford collection or now in the Met. So dispersion of collections and how things get out there and when they get out there in times of difficulty, times of war, or sometimes like times now when it's great economic boom and there's enough money being paid for works of art that they come out onto the market where they might not have otherwise. There's a whole interesting series of other things to talk about. But now we're on to calligraphy and poetry.
Without further ado, I want to go ahead and make sure we leave plenty of time for the very interesting group of papers that we have for today's panel, this afternoon's panel. My name is Robert Ashmore. I'm an associate professor of classical Chinese literature here at UC Berkeley, and I will be chairing the afternoon session. And the first paper that we have on the afternoon panel will be presented by Professor Peter Sturman from UC Santa Barbara. Professor Sturman is chair of the Department of Art and Architecture at UC Santa Barbara, and is interested particularly in the Han Dynasty clerical script, the Li Shu, and the evolution of calligraphy as a consciously practiced art. He's also now working on a book on Northern Song literati theory and practice of painting that is now entitled Painting and the Historical Mind in Song Dynasty China. So then please join me in welcoming Professor Sturman. He'll be presenting a paper entitled Spreading Fallen Flowers, Shen Zhou and the Dissemination of Image.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this elegant gathering conference. I had the honor of meeting George Ye many years ago in Taiwan. It was spring 1980, and through a friend was invited to go out to dinner with Mr. Ye and some of his family. I remember anticipating some extraordinary Chinese cuisine. We had pizza. And I met his son Max a couple of years later in Cleveland through the same friend. We went to a kung fu movie. I'm not sure if either of these counted as elegant gatherings, but they are certainly interesting comments on the hybridity of 20th century China and the meaningfulness of chance encounters. In any case, it is truly an honor to be here and to be able to participate, however humbly, with an initial effort on a new subject, and a pleasure to have the opportunity to reminisce about earlier times. In certain respects, my paper is about reminiscing as a powerful and defining function of culture in China. Reminiscing was so powerful, in fact, that it was not limited to how we commonly think of it, which is looking back in time to contemplate past figures and past events, but also as a projection into the future to consider from that undefined perspective how the future will contemplate the present. Projecting is an act of the subjective self, and the ultimate focus is precisely on oneself and how the image of oneself appears to others. Specifically, this paper is about the cultivation of image for the present and the future that the celebrated Ming artist Shen Zhou produced through a dedicated program of poems, paintings, and calligraphy on the subject of falling flowers, or perhaps more accurately, falling blossoms. This is a very preliminary work inspired by the Asian Art Museum's display of an album of Shen's transcription of 19 of the falling flower poems. But in truth, this is a subject that has fascinated me ever since I saw this painting by Shen Zhou in the National Palace Museum 20+ years ago. I'm reminiscing again. Falling flowers happens to be a very large subject and a very important one, as it absorbed much of Shen Zhou's creative energy in the last years of his life. My intention today is to introduce the subject and its scope, singling out some of its key thematic features, and in particular, its function as a conduit for the dissemination of a personally crafted self-image. Shen Zhou's exploration of the falling flowers theme appears to have begun in 1503, when Shen was 76 years old. In the autumn of that year, he wrote 10 falling flowers poems on a hand scroll, now in the Shanghai Museum. A fan painting, also in the Shanghai Museum, dated the 3rd month of the same year, depicting an old man leaning on a cane by a riverbank amidst falling petals from a blossoming tree, suggests that Shen may have been inspired to explore the theme in the previous spring. A year later, again in the season of falling blossoms, Shen Zhou shared his 10 verses with 2 youthful followers, Wen Zhengming and Xu Jianqing, 2 of the most promising cultural figures of the next generation of Suzhou literati. Wen and Xu rhymed Shen's verses, whereupon Shen Zhou answered with another 10 verses in response. Lu Chang, minister of the Court of Imperial Sacrifices, and a respected literary figure in his own right, was brought into the circle and also rhymed Shen's original 10 poems, when Wen Zhengming brought the poems to Nanjing. Shen Zhou answered with another 10 in response, giving him now a total of 30. At some point, Tang Yin joined the party and rhymed all 30 of Shen Zhou's poems. Clearly, it did not end here, because in one of Shen Zhou's collections of poetry, Shi Tian Shi Xuan, there are not 30 poems recorded, but 50. Over the next few years, flowers were falling everywhere. In 1504, Wen Zhengming transcribed Shen Zhou's, Lu Chang's, Xu Jianqing's, and his own poems in an album of 20 leaves, and separately again in a hand scroll. Shen Zhou painted the falling flowers theme in 1506 and added what he claims to be the 30 poems of the first go-around. This painting, which is in the Nanjing Museum, also includes an important explanatory inscription by Shen Zhou that we will look at presently. That same year, 1506, this album, now on exhibit at the Asian Art Museum, was written at an unidentified location called the Jinqing Hall. 19 of the falling flowers poems are transcribed. An undated Shen Zhou hand scroll, now in a private collection, transcribes 13 of the falling flower poems. Finally, in 1508, 1 year before his death, Shen Zhou painted this marvelous scroll in the National Palace Museum and included 10 of his now extremely famous falling flowers poems. All of this, of course, is only counting what is immediately available. A little digging, no doubt, would uncover more examples from textual records. The falling flowers poems immediately became a celebrated event in early 16th century Suzhou, and their fame spread far. According to an early book catalog, Chen Cao collected the falling flowers poems and published them in a single fascicle. This included not only the poems of Shen Zhou, Wen Zhengming, Xu Jianqing, Lu Chang, and Tang Yin, but another 4 unspecified figures as well. This, together with the fact that Shen Zhou ultimately ended up with 50 poems, clearly shows that considerably more versifying and rhyming took place. In traditional critiques of Shen Zhou's poetry, one commonly finds specific references to the falling flowers poems. They were considered his finest, most representative compositions. Precisely because they were disseminated widely and appeared in print from an early date, prudent scholars should look long and hard at all of these extant falling flowers paintings and calligraphies. There couldn't be a more natural target for forgeries. Collectors out there are probably wondering what I'm going to say next. This, in any case, was my thinking when I came up to San Francisco a few weeks ago and saw the album, this album in particular. But I was pleasantly surprised by the quality of the calligraphy. It will take more study to determine how many of the falling flowers scrolls and albums in fact are genuine. But at this preliminary stage, I would like to suggest that there is reason to believe that Shen Zhou did, in fact, make multiple versions of the program as part of a concerted effort to spread his image. Note, for example, the scroll of 13 poems now in a private collection. This strikes the viewer as an odd number of falling flowers poems, until we read in Shen Zhou's trailing inscription that he wrote as many as the paper would allow. In other words, there was a demand for these poems and a plan of contingency. There no doubt was some meaning to the poems in their original sequence of composing and answering, but once written, the poems became part of a broad repertoire that Shen Zhou would glean on the spot. Usually he would transcribe 10, 20, or 30 of the 50 that he ultimately wrote, but if the length of the paper allowed only 13, so be it. Mostly he drew upon the original 30, but others appear as well, and there is no fixed order. What is important to recognize is these poems, divorced from their original context, functioned as signifiers of the person, and their repetition was part of a process whose purpose was to project a particular image. What was that image? We begin by looking more closely at the Falling Flowers poems and the question of their origin. A key document explaining Shen Zhou's inspiration is his own lengthy inscription that follows the short painting in the Nanjing Museum, dated 1506. He begins by citing a line from a Tang poem: "The myriad things follow the great creator. For what purpose a solitary flower?" He then continues, "Only old people feel the depths of this idea. Young people aren't ready. When old, one sits in useless idleness, and it becomes necessary to dally with beautiful flowers to enjoy the pleasure of stimulating sensual thoughts and forgetting that old age has arrived." In the spring of the Yichou year of the Hongzhi reign, which is 1505, I fell ill for an entire month. When I finally arose from bed, I rushed outside, only to find that the blossoms had been swept clean of the trees, bits of red and white filling the ground. I missed their opening and only saw their falling. This filled me with such sadness. Touching objects, I created verses. I titled the 10 quatrains "Falling Flowers" and sent them to Zhengming, Wen Zhengming of course, one who understands me. We'll visit the second half of this inscription a little bit later. There are a number of notable points in Shen Zhou's explanation for the Falling Flowers project, beginning with the discrepancy of the dates. I suggest we not be too demanding here. After all, Shen Zhou was 80 years old and may simply have forgotten. More intriguing is Shen's claim of having been moved to write the poems after falling ill for a month and missing the blossoms' seasonal opening. Slightly later commentators point out that the Falling Flowers theme originated with two northern Song scholars, the brothers Song Qi and Song Xiang. Now, these were prominent figures at Renzong's court, and as suggested in a number of Song dynasty miscellany, it was precisely the brothers' verses on falling flowers that earned them praise and advancement. This goes unmentioned by Shen Zhou, but others made a comparison between Shen and the Song brothers. The Qing literary critic Wang Shizhen noted that whereas the two Song brothers acquired names for themselves by chiseling and engraving, or in other words, by crafting intricate poems, Shen Zhou's Falling Flowers poems managed to possess ideas beyond the words without attending to such labor. His poems present an image of naturalness. Naturalness was precisely the image that Shen Zhou sought. It was a goal, moreover, that he sought in each of the expressive arts: poetry, calligraphy, and painting. Now let's take a closer look at how that process unfolded. This will be familiar to many of you, I'm sure. It is well known that Shen Zhou underwent a crisis of sorts around the age of 40. His early artistic development was characterized by diligent faithfulness to inherited models, following a pattern of practice that was strongly endorsed by the older generation of Shen's relatives and teachers. His paintings, for example, could be large, labored productions in the style of Yuan masters such as Wang Meng. This is the well-known lofty Mount Lu, painted for his teacher, Shen Zhou's teacher, Chen Quan, on his 70th birthday in 1467. His calligraphy, here Shen's inscription from the same painting, again followed practices established by the older generation. Neat, abundantly spaced and pliant, it is standard script calligraphy that pronounces methods and orthodoxy. Liu Jue's portrayal of the Qingbai studio, that's this painting, painted in 1458, possesses inscriptions by Shen Zhou's grandfather, Shen Cheng, which is, Shen Cheng, okay, well actually they're all listed there, I don't have to point them out, Shen Hongji, and Liu Jue himself, who was an older mentor. Grandpa Shen's calligraphy, written at the age of 83, is a bit looser, but all three write in a similar style to what is seen in Shen Zhou's inscription on lofty Mount Lu. It is a style of calligraphy that stems from Zhao Mengfu. Here's an example of Zhao's small-size standard writing. Sorry if I'm racing through these a little bit. You know, the images are tied to my narrative. And became standardized by the early Ming calligraphers Sun Ke and Shen Zhou. As for Shen Zhou's poetry, it was natural for him to be deeply influenced by his grandfather and father, both of whom had excellent reputations as poets. According to the 17th century critic Qian Yi, at one point in his life, Shen Zhou burned all of his youthful writings, considering them too derivative. We do not know precisely when this happened, but a parallel crisis of identity appears in Shen Zhou's inscription for this sketchy landscape he painted while drunk for Liu Jue circa 1470. This is the famous inscription, the poem anyway, Mi Fu but not Mi Fu, Huang Gong Wang but not Huang Gong Wang. I am ashamed of being the ugly consort Mo Mu, striving to become the beautiful Mao Qiang. It's a well-known inscription. I don't know, it might be new to some of you, but it's basically talking about how he's imitating Mi Fu, he's imitating Huang Gong Wang, and yet he doesn't quite get there, so he's wondering who he is. What happens to Shen Zhou after this is well established, at least in rough strokes. The crisis eventually passes as Shen Zhou searches deeply within himself and the world around him, assumes a detached Buddhist attitude, and becomes the local savant. The justly famous Night Vigil of 1492, with its remarkable long inscription, is the classic work that establishes Shen Zhou as the suburban mystic, deeply listening to the mundane sounds of Suzhou in the middle of the night and penetrating their meaning. A corresponding style for painting is found largely in the blunt, childlike style of Wu Zhen, the Yuan dynasty master, calligraphy in a homogenized, if distinctive rendition of the Song writer Huang Tingjian. Yet simply accepting these stylistic choices without further examination is an act of delinquency on our part. Whether or not Shen Zhou truly found his enlightenment, there was a process that underlay the development of this mature style. In my opinion, Shen Zhou's choices were largely driven by a deep attraction to the Northern Song literati culture, and more specifically to Su Shi and his circle of talented friends. The evidence is strong. As later commentators frequently point out, Shen Zhou's poetry is in the plain style of the Tang poet Bo Jui, Lu You of the Southern Song, and in particular Su Shi. His calligraphy is modeled after Su Shi's closest associate. That, of course, is Huang Tingjian. Why Huang Tingjian and not Su Shi? Hard to say. It may have been a personal preference, or perhaps it was the fact that Shen Zhou's family owned a number of Huang Tingjian calligraphies. Certainly, Huang's association with Chan monks would have been attractive to Shen Zhou, who was seeking a style that was at once individualistic, yet capable of signifying detachment from worldly concern. This directs us to the primary attraction of Su Shi to Shen Zhou, a philosophical outlook on life that eschews material, worldly success for immersion in the simple pleasures of the everyday, and the spiritual and the common. This was the legacy of Su Shi, the layman of East Slope, who wrote frequently and famously about the need to remain unattached, to be able to roam around things without becoming ensnared by desire, to look, for example, at valuable paintings and calligraphies as nothing more than clouds and mist passing by one's eyes. Another important connection for Shen Zhou was the famous comment Su Shi made with reference to the bamboo painter Wen Tong, complaining that people only knew him for his painting, not recognizing that his painting was but a transformation of his calligraphy, which in turn was the leftovers of his poetry, all of which was tied to the virtue and substance of Wen Tong, the person. Shen Zhou, too, was primarily known for his paintings, and it was commonly lamented by those who critiqued his poetry that few recognized his talent in the world of letters. All of this brings us back to Falling Flowers. The project, first and foremost, is about poetry, and I'm certain that this is how Shen Zhou viewed it. Painting and calligraphy are but vehicles for the dissemination of Shen's literary talent. The poems themselves focus predominantly on the theme of impermanence and the passage of time, provide their own distinct echoes of Su Shi. There were, of course, countless poets who likened blossoms to youth or feminine beauty and lamented their passing, But there's no question that Shen Zhou had Su Shi in mind when at least some of the Falling Flowers poems were composed. There is a direct allusion to Su Shi in one of the poems. It is the third poem of the second set that Shen Zhou composed, responding to the poems written by Wen Zhongming and Xu Jianqing. It is the fourth poem in the album on display in the Asian Art Museum, and the 13th, or the last poem on the hand scroll that I am once again showing. It reads, well, you can all read it yourselves. Maybe I can pass on that. But note the two middle lines there. Adhering to mud, master like Master Liao, but no sign of his craziness, clinging to this thing. Old man Slope earned a name for doing wrong. Those are the key lines. Master Liao, in line 3, refers to the Buddhist monk Can Liao, who was a close friend of Su Shi. Once served by a beautiful young entertainer who was sent by Su Shi, Can Liao, I was expecting the 5-minute one, not the 2-minute one. Can Liao wrote a self-mocking poem likening himself to a mud-stuck willow catkin that, in a very un-Buddhist manner, wishes to follow the wind and crazily fly up and down in pursuit of springtime passions. Old Man Slope is Su Shi. This line refers to a series of poems on plum blossoms that Su Shi wrote, one of which claims, clinging to this thing is indeed my error. Clinging to this one thing. Both allusions refer to the central issue of attachment, feminine youth and beauty. Objects of desire are overlaid with images of blossoms blown by the wind. Can Liao and Su Shi comment self-deprecatingly on how difficult it is to remain detached from such seductions. Shen Zhou echoes this, but in typical fashion, and even more self-mocking. He's literally stuck in the mud, too boring to even emulate Can Liao's craziness. The ephemeral flowers of his poem, literally filling the sky like snow, contrast with the temple of long life. Their short life, however, is not to be lamented. This is the way of creation. No room for attachments. The centrality of this theme and the significance of the allusion to Su Shi are revealed in Shen Zhou's inscription that follows the Nanjing Museum hand scroll. This, you will remember, is the inscription that explains the initial inspiration for the Falling Flowers poems in Shen Zhou's illness of 1505. The rest of the inscription is even more engaging and important. Shen Zhou narrates that Wen Zhongming and Lu Chang rhymed his poems, far surpassing the quote-unquote old, clumsy, and decaying verses that he initially wrote. Yet, as he writes, ugly old Muomu is again not ashamed of her own repulsiveness, referring to himself. As Shen makes an effort, I can underline that, Qiang, to answer with more poems, ultimately leading to 30. The poems are collected, published, and disseminated. Shen's quote-unquote rotten verses carried along for a free ride to fame on the backs of the younger talents. And then I'll just read a translation of the last portion here. Someone said to me, Su Changgong, Su Shi, once engaged in a 3-round series of rhyming poems on plum blossoms, from their opening to their falling. Are you trying to emulate him? I responded, Su Shi here has his clinging to this one thing fault, but in rhyming, he himself carried it as far as clinging to one thing. In contrast, my agitated pushing of the two lords arose solely out of chance. Now, however, I've taken what was once without action, Wu Wei, and have the fault of adding to it action, Yo Wei. This is the same as attaching oneself to the empty boat, yet angrily striking out at the floating blossoms. Truly, this is a difficult charge. If one is old, yet possesses a youthful heart, and uses youthful words to compete with others, one understands that this is a fault of one's own bringing. Others will laugh at me, and I have no argument. There are some difficult ideas in this passage, but the gist is clear. Shen Zhou contrasts Su Shi's engagement with poetry and attachment to the blossoms with his own chance or accidental involvement. After all, he did not ask Wen Zhongming and Lu Chang to rhyme his poems. However, Shen Zhou then does what any properly enlightened, properly detached sage should not do. He adds action to the inaction. He engages in a competitive round-robin of poetry writing with his younger colleagues. Clearly, he is chastened by this bit of unseemliness, this foolish swiping at falling blossoms. The last lines clarify what this is all about. Though approaching 80, Shen Zhou still possesses a youthful heart. He's not ready to relinquish his passions. He's not ready for the end. Okay, I'm going to just summarize very quickly the very end, a couple more pages. I wanted to point out that this is not the image of Shen Zhou that we commonly see. You know, we think of Shen Zhou as reaching the stage of total enlightenment late in his life, and just painting in a kind of a placid, fully accepted manner. And yet the falling flowers demonstrate something very, very different. They show that right to the end of his life, really, he was very much engaged with this inability to relinquish the sense of competition with the younger generation and the passions within his own heart. And I wanted to end by looking at this painting a little bit more closely, the Falling Flowers painting of 1508, contrasting it with some of the earlier paintings, and pointing out the importance of the distant landscape in this, and how really what the painting is all about, in many ways, is about reminiscing. And let me just finish by reading this. Shen Zhou portrays himself gazing off into a distant landscape of strangely archaic forms that hint equally of monumentality and mystery. Climbing on high and gazing into the distance was recognized as a particular act of memorializing. One commonly did this in the company of friends, taking occasion to pause and take stock of those who had preceded and looked out at the same view, and to wonder how many had passed on into obscurity, their deeds and merit never recorded. Lastly, one contemplated how others in the future would look at the same view and perhaps consider our present. What are our accomplishments, our merits? Shen Zhou uses his falling flowers as a means to engage that company of friends and those unknown future viewers to offer a modest reflection on this act of reminiscing. Okay, well, if there was one last paragraph, I can pass on that. Thank you very much.
Our next presenter in the afternoon panel will be Professor Jeffrey Riegel, my colleague in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures here at UC Berkeley. Professor Riegel holds the Agassiz Chair in Chinese, is a professor of Chinese culture and literature in our department, the most prestigious name chair in our program, and is our most senior China side faculty member. Professor Riegel's our associations with his work are primarily with early China. There's the thought and culture and archaeology of pre-dynastic China, but in today's presentation, he'll be delving into a much later period and a topic of recent interest to him of, I believe, the last half year, a year or so in Yuan Mei. So please join me in welcoming my colleague, Professor Jeffrey Riegel. He will be presenting a talk on Yuan Mei and a different elegant gathering.
Thank you, Robert. And I'd like also to express my thanks to the organizers of the symposium for inviting me and allowing an interloper from the Warring States and Qin period to present in this time period and about later literature and art history. In 1790, Yuan Mei did something unprecedented. He organized the first of several gatherings for women poets. Yuan Mei's long life had already been marked by unconventional behavior, of such an extreme nature on two occasions, in 1769 and 1772, it appeared he might be prosecuted by the Qing authorities. That he escaped official condemnation is testimony both to his extraordinary reputation as a poet and scholar and to government connections that included some of the most important Manchu officials in the Qing government. Taking female disciples was not in itself unprecedented, and sponsoring women's literature was probably not regarded as especially unconventional in the 18th century. What was unusual was that Yuan Mei organized his poetry gatherings very late in his life, and that they involved a relatively large number of young women from a variety of locales in the lower Yangtze River area. It seems that the sicker and older Yuan Mei became, the more he depended on the company of female followers. Some people, perhaps with good reason, suspected that Yuan Mei's motives in taking female disciples were less than pure. After Yuan Mei's death, his younger contemporary, the lamentably ultra-conservative Jiang Xuecheng, attacked with excessive vitriol Yuan Mei and his relations with his female students. Yuan Mei's attitude and behavior toward women were no doubt complicated. He studied and observed them as sexual objects, paying paying special attention to the quality of a woman's skin, assessing it as one might the glaze on fine Ming Dynasty porcelain. In the spring and autumn seasons, Yuan Mei opened the gates of Suiyuan, his garden villa in Nanjing, to women visitors. He strategically placed mirrors throughout the grounds so he could observe women adjusting their clothes, makeup, and hair. Extremely popular among his female visitors was a giant European mirror given to Yuan Mei by the provincial governor of Zhejiang. In his memoirs, Yuan Mei's grandson, Yuan Zuzhi, reports that so many women clustered around the mirror that it took days for the lingering fake fragrance of their perfumes to dissipate. Yuan Mei's writings expose another side of his view of women. In numerous tales of the supernatural that he gathered together in his Zibuyu, Things Confucius Would Not Speak Of, Yuan Mei dwells on the plight of women abused by callous men. He makes it clear that such women are unlikely to receive justice from the civil authorities of the Qing. Their prayers will only be answered by a God who takes pity on them and avenges the wrongs they suffer. In Yuan Mei's stories, women unable to wait for such cosmic retribution take matters into their own hands. Claiming to be possessed by demonic spirits, they wreak havoc on their husbands and families until right is done by them. Tales such as these are what attracted me, or what first attracted me to Yuan Mei and to the subject of his relations with women. 25 years before the first of his poetry gatherings, Yuan Mei had staged in 1765 a more traditional, elegant gathering at Suiyuan. In the fashion of the famous Xiyuan Yaji, the elegant gathering in the Western Garden, attended by Su Shi, Mi Fu, and other Song luminaries, 4 of Yuan Mei's male colleagues joined him in his garden villa to engage in reading, playing the zither, conversing, and fishing. Yuan Mei asked the wuxi artist, Wu Shengceng, to paint the scene and was overjoyed with how the artist had brought the participants, in Yuan Mei's words, to life in his painting. So pleased was he with the results that Yuan asked acquaintances to inscribe the painting. Among those he invited to record their reactions to it were one of his female disciples, Luo Qilan, as well as the 2 sisters Sun Yunfeng and Sun Yunhe. Yuan seems to have been especially pleased with what the Sun sisters wrote, for he composed a response to thank them, probably in 1790. And he wrote the response, of course, as a poem. He said, "I could intone at length on the talent that originates in the women's quarters, as 2 by 2 the pearls and jade compete for the beautiful flower. The instant I unroll the painting, a fragrant breeze rises. The flower lyrics of the 2 sisters of West Lake are fully open. These 2 jade-like talented women have signed their names as students and presented lyrics from afar." And here he's probably quoting from them. "We fear not even 3 feet of snow at the gate of Chang'e. Our sincere wish is to stand at your home for a very long time." Their words make white-haired Yuan's pleasure turn to surprise, a fine tale to be preserved in my home for 1,000 autumns. The lecture halls between the Yellow and Fun rivers are filled with dukes and marquis. Surely at the edge of heaven, there's a place for the weaving girl star. Yuan Mei's insistence on the talent of women poets was a recurrent theme in his later poetry and other writings. For example, in his supplement to his Suiyuan poetry talks, he notes, "Ignorant indeed is the vulgar claim that women ought not write poetry. Confucius himself observed that 3 poems that capped the canonical book of songs were done by women." Yuan Mei is deeply moved by the women's equating him with the Song Dynasty Neo-Confucian master Chang'e and their profession of loyalty to him. Their sentiments cause Yuan Mei to muse ironically that in an academic world dominated by men, there must be some corner at the edge of heaven that women might occupy. In 1789, Sun Yunfeng had written another poem asking Yuan Mei to permit her to become his disciple. Sun Yunfeng and her younger sister, Yunhe, were the daughters of Sun Jiale, who had recently retired from his official career after holding powerful positions in Yunnan and Sichuan, and returned home to Hangzhou, where he built his garden villa, the Baoshi Shanzhuang. on the shores of West Lake. Yuan Mei was on friendly terms with Sun Jiale and had exchanged poems, paintings, and other gifts with him. Sun Jiale wrote a letter to Yuan Mei requesting that he agreed to teach his two daughters. Though Yuan Mei initially modestly declined the requests on the grounds that he was unworthy to teach such talented girls, eventually he agreed to become their teacher. This is what led to the poetry gathering of 1790. In the 4th month of 1790, Yuan Mei traveled to Hangzhou to sweep the graves of his parents. He took the opportunity to visit Sun Jiale and his daughters at their garden villa. After spending a pleasant time living at Sun Jiale's guest house at the Baoshi Shanzhuang, Yuan Mei made preparations to depart and return home to Suiyuan on the 13th day of the month. To give him a proper send-off, Sun Yunfeng invited 13 women poets to present Yuan with their own paintings and poems. In a note that he perhaps composed at the time or shortly thereafter, and which is now preserved as an entry in the supplement to his Suiyuan poetry talks, Yuan Mei refers happily to this event, describes the 2 banquet tables he'd prepared to welcome his 13 guests, and singles out the woman poet Xu Yuxin, who presented a landscape painting and 4 accompanying poems. In his note, Yuan Mei doesn't identify the other women present at the poetry gathering, but he does give a couple of, later on he gives a couple of other names. A 1792 journey to Mount Tiantai again brought Yuan Mei to Hangzhou, where he was Sun Jiale's guest for a second time. As was the case 2 years earlier, on the 13th day of the 4th month, a poetry gathering was organized so that, in the words of Sun Yunhe, Yuan Mei could transmit the classics. This time, Yuan Mei invited 7 female disciples, apparently fewer than in 1790, though Sun Yunhe notes that the disciples were even more numerous than those who'd attended the earlier poetry gathering. And to prove this point, she mentions the presence of 2 women scholars who were newly receiving instruction from Yuan Mei, Qian Lin and Pan Suxin. Perhaps this should cause us to reconsider whether or not 13 women actually attended the 1790 gathering. Apparently, on his journey home to Suiyuan at the conclusion of the 1792 poetry gathering, Yuan Mei stopped in Suzhou, where he invited 13 women poets from that area to meet with him at Tiger Hill. We learn this in Yuan Mei's epitaph for Jin Yi, one of the women he invited to the Suzhou gathering. In addition to what the epitaph tells us about the circumstances of the Suzhou gathering, it's also noteworthy for what it reveals about what Yuan Mei felt towards the female poets he admired. I've observed the world carefully for a long time, and every woman with talent I've met has been unlucky. Those who are also beautiful are even more unlucky. Women possessed of both talent and beauty, who've married men who match them in talent and beauty, are the most unlucky. Xian, i.e. Jin Yi, had all 3 reasons to be unlucky. It would have been difficult to wish her to survive for a long time in the world of men. My 3 sisters were talented, and all 3 of them died young. Among my female disciples, Sir Xu Wenmu's daughter, Xu Yuxin, was the most talented, and she died the youngest. Of my other disciples, if they were not lonely, then they were poor. While clearly not oblivious to their beauty, what seems most to have drawn Yuan Mei to the literary women he knew was that because of their beauty and talent, their lives were destined to be even more tragic in his eyes than the ordinary women whose misfortunes he chronicled in his tales of the supernatural. To commemorate the poetry gatherings that had occurred in Hangzhou and Suzhou in 1790 and 1792, Yuan Mei commissioned 2 artists, You Shao and Wang Gong, to do a painting entitled "The 13 Female Disciples of Suiyuan Request Instruction at Lake Tower." I've pieced this long scroll together from individual black and white photos that have been published. The Lake Tower of the title refers to Sun Jiale's garden villa in Hangzhou, and the first part of the scroll, is there a laser pointer What am I missing? Push the bottom button? Okay. So if one looks, one of course reads the scroll from right to left, and the first part of the scroll consists of 5 scenes in the garden villa, the first 4 of which show 13 of Yuan Mei's female disciples engaged in various refined activities. The 5th scene, and I'll show you a few details, is a portrait of Yuan Mei himself. In a colophon that follows these scenes here, Yuan Mei identifies each woman, provides information on her important male relatives, and briefly describes what she's doing in the scene. He does this, he says, so that his painting might be the equal of the painting of the ranks of the true spirits, the Zhenling Weiye Tu of Tao Hongjing. In the painting to which Yuan Mei alludes, Tao Hongjing, whose dates are 452 to 536, arranged in a hierarchy the spirits worshipped by all the major branches of the Taoist religion, placing in the upper register the gods revered by his own Shangqing, or highest clarity sect. This comparison is not the only evidence that Yuan Mei was extremely proud of the painting of his female disciples. He evidently carried it with him, stuffed in his sleeve, and would take it out to show friends and invite a favored few to inscribe it. One early witness claims that there were over 30 inscriptions following Yuan's second colophon. And I haven't seen the original, and I certainly haven't seen photographs of the remainder. In the first scene of Yuan Mei's painting, the Sun sisters stroll beneath willows on the shore of West Lake. In the second scene, Xi Peilan plays the lute. Seated next to her is Xu Yuxing. The woman grasping an orchid, standing, is Wang Duo. In the following vignette, Wang Shen, here, is about to inscribe a banana leaf. The young woman standing behind her is Yan Ruizhu. Liao Yunjun sits at the table holding a brush, and in Yuan Mei's words, she appears to be thinking about something. Opposite her at the table is Zhang Yuzhen, while Chu Wanxian sits at the end of the table. In the painting's 4th scene, Jiang Xinbao is shown standing against bamboos. Again, off to the right. The woman in the center, holding a round fan, is Jin Yi, and Bao Zhihui is fishing over here. In the 5th and final scene, we see Yuan Mei himself seated at the table, attended by his nephew's wife, Dai Lanying, shown with her small son seated there. Following Yuan Mei's first colophon is an additional scene portraying 3 women, obviously painted by another hand. In the colophon that follows it, and you can see part of it here, in the colophon that follows that scene, Yuan Mei explains, in the spring of the year 1795, I again went to Lake Tower for a second meeting on the composition of poetry. I would not have guessed that the 2 women, Xu Yuxin and Jin Yi, would have both already died. For a long time I mourned them. Fortunately, 3 additional ladies came to ask for lessons. The previous painters were unable to help out, and so I relied on my old friend, Sir Cui Gong, to add a small addition to the end of the scroll. He succeeded in imitating the style of the earlier part. Yuan Mei then identifies the three women in the added painting. Cao Ciqing is shown with a sprig of peach blossoms in her hand. Luo Qilan has an orchid dangling from her waist. The lady in red is Qianlin, and Yuan Mei says of her, she looks as if she's about to engage Luo Qilan in conversation. The painting of the 13 female disciples of Sui Yuan, this painting of them requesting instruction at Lake Tower, is something of a puzzle. First, it's evident that its various scenes constitute an idealized rendering of Yuan Mei's poetry gatherings, rather than an actual and historically accurate depiction of any one of them. Jin Yi and Xu Yuxin were not part of the Hangzhou gatherings in 1790 and 1792. They were from Suzhou and may not even have met Yuan Mei before he convened a gathering there. Similarly, Xi Peilan did not meet Yuan Mei until 1794, and so probably never attended any of the poetry gatherings, let alone play the zither at one. An explanation of these liberties may have to do with how much Yuan Mei favored Jin Yi, Xu Yuxin, and Xi Peilan. The epitaph quoted above makes clear that he deeply mourned Jin Yi's death and identifies Xu Yuxin as the most talented of his disciples. We know from elsewhere in his writings that Yuan Mei especially prized the images of Jin Yi and Xi Peilan. He refers to small portraits of them that he kept and had inscribed. This suggests that what Yuan Mei wanted his artists to portray was a gathering of his favorite female disciples, rather than a gathering that actually occurred. Also puzzling is Yuan's insistence that the painting portrays 13 disciples. The number clearly had special significance. After all, in both 1790 and 1792, the 13th day of the fourth month was chosen for the poetry gathering. But there's insufficient evidence to determine whether any of the actual gatherings was in fact attended by exactly 13 women. I've come to regard these many references to 13 women as metaphorical rather than literal. The complexities involved in understanding the painting appear to have inspired Xi Peilan to write a poem about it, a poem in which she plays with the idea of being portrayed as part of an event at which she wasn't present, partly unlocks the code of the number 13, and contemplates the long-term importance of Yuan Mei's transmitting classics to women. I'll read the poem. I'll do this very quickly, Robert. Treasure Stone Mountain Lodge on the shore of Mirror Lake, the clearest lake in the world of men, an island of immortals. For 10 years I dreamt in vain of Hangzhou's western cold bridge. Then before I knew it, my whole body had entered the painting. There the master sat erect, wielding his colored brush, while we competed to offer up our inscribed jade tablets and ask for the red banner of his teaching. Among them was one who played the lute, who looked like me. Counting them, we can see that on the lute, I apologize for the quality of these, but this is a blow-up of Xi Peilan playing the lute. And as she notes, on the lute there are 13 stops illustrated on its side. There are exactly 13 stops. Selected and printed, the new songs illuminate the Jade Tower. Each person in the scroll tailored one with her own hands. The old lady of Bai Juyi's family and Kang Cheng's girl servant were never permitted to enter and observe their masters teach. The long-lived old man has surpassed 100 years. She's referring to Yuan Mei himself. His rank, in fact, is one of the Taoist gods. I hope he'll follow the example of Fu Sheng transmitting the classics, so that each disciple will get one classic. What trouble is there if those who come later are superior? This way, 26 people will in the end obtain the proper model. It's just like the jade tablet in 13 lines. The copies in everyone's possession have new lines added. Like the protagonist in Pu Songling's short story, The Mural, Xi Peilan takes us into a painting of a paradise scene. She and the other women in the scene, Xi Peilan tells us, are competing in a poetry contest, vying for the favor of Yuan Mei, and composing poems for inclusion in a book of new songs. The rightness of the number 13 is explained in Xi's poem by the fact that it's echoed by the 13 stops on the zither she herself plays in an imaginary scene, the 13 classics that masters transmit to their students, and the 13 columns of characters that make up the jade tablet written by the most famous of all calligraphers, Wang Duo. Xi Peilan compares her situation and that of other disciples with women like the old crone in Bai Juyi's family or Zheng Xuan's maid. Though they showed great talent in poetry, they have not been permitted a classical education. Xi Peilan praises Yuan Mei, whose representation in the painting proves that he's a real Taoist god, and requests that he be a latter-day equal of the Han Dynasty scholiast Fu Sheng and transmit the classics to his female disciples. What problem is there, Xi Peilan asks, if such latecomers to classical learning should surpass those of earlier times? For the model provided by Yuan will spread by multiples of 13 among an ever-increasing number of women. This is right, and how learning is. It multiplies. All current copies made by students imitating Wang Xizhi's original 13-column classic model of good calligraphy have many more than 13 columns. As instructive and fascinating as Xi Peilan's reading of the painting is, I imagine that for Yuan Mei, it may have possessed meaning and significance of another sort. I see him treasuring it, carrying it in his sleeve, and insisting that others praise it in verse, because it immortalized women he admired and adored, some of whom had died tragically early. Shown as eternally young, gathering on the shores of Hangzhou's paradisiacal West Lake and engaging in the refined arts, these 13 talented and beautiful women were his own private Shangqing gods. The appreciation and inscriptions of others with whom he shared it would have magnified several-fold the significance of the scroll in Yuan Mei's eyes, even if the painting itself would not ultimately prove effective in warding off the illnesses that increasingly plagued him, or arresting any further advances in his already considerable old age. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Jeff. I would like now to welcome Professor Bai Chen. Professor Bai is going to be speaking to us on, let's see, I have my list here. Sorry. I'm going to make sure I get the title exactly right. He'll be speaking to us today on Missionaries and Chinese Calligraphy in the late Ming and early Qing period, a preliminary study of Wang Duo's calligraphy album for Johann Adam Schall von Bell. Professor Bai is Associate Professor of Art History at Boston University and has written a number of works on Chinese calligraphy and aesthetics, particularly the Qing calligrapher Fu Shan, the author of a book entitled Fu Shan's World, The Transformation of Chinese Calligraphy in the 17th Century. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bai to present to that panel.
The Jesuit priest Matteo Ricci arrived in China in 1583, the 11th of the famous Wan Li reign, and worked there for 27 years until his death. The most influential Western missionary in the later Ming China, not only did Ricci make many religious converts in China, he also introduced Western knowledge to China. As a pioneer of cultural relation between China and the West, Ricci's profound appreciation of Chinese cultural and moral values enabled him to make China known to the West and the West to China. Several times, Ricci mentions in his writings the art of Chinese calligraphy, because the Chinese literally took for granted many of the social roles and the practice with which calligraphy was then associated. Ricci's descriptions of Chinese calligraphy are freshly informative because they come from an outside perspective. Ricci's China in 17th century mentions one of his best Chinese friends, Zhu Shilu. He says that he was very highly esteemed by everyone and was celebrated as a moral philosopher. Moreover, he was so well known as a writer of Chinese characters, as a penman. are art more highly regarded in China than in Europe, that only a few lines of his simple writing sold in Nanjing for a high price. A few years later, the value of this manuscript had greatly increased. As Ricci correctly points out, calligraphy was more highly regarded in China than in Europe. A substantial number of Zhu Shilu's writings and calligraphies survived today. This is one. And it is likely that Zhu wrote calligraphies for Ricci, as it is unlikely that they have survived. But from Ricci's records, we know he received many calligraphies, especially in folding fan format. A passage from Ricci's journal reads, "One particular trade here is far more universal than elsewhere, namely that of making fans. Ordinarily, these fans are used to temper the breezes during the season of greater heat, and they are carried by every class and by both sexes. It would be considered a lack of taste to appear in public without a fan. Those used by the upper classes are generally made of bright paper decorated with design beautifully traced in gold. Sometimes, too, these fans are inscribed with essays or poems. The gift most frequently exchanged as a sign of friendship and esteem is a fan. We have at house a box full of these gift fans, which we in turn gave to others as a proof of friendship." So you can see here is a portrait of Ricci and his follower Xu Guangqi, a Chinese follower. And you can see both of them actually are holding a fan. And also some records show that, written records show that during later Ming, people frequently exchange fans. And also, you can see this is a plate made in Jingdezhen in the 17th century. You can see all the four figures are holding fans. From Ricci's journal, we also know that Western missionaries not only knew the Chinese esteemed calligraphy, but that they also were aware of the social functions of calligraphy. Thus, they may have made social uses of calligraphy in their everyday lives. Another paragraph in Ricci's journal reads, "When the governor discovered that the European priests were more advanced in learning and more cultured than he had imagined, he decided to confer upon them a certain favor which the Chinese held in high esteem. When a magistrate wishes to make a public demonstration of his affection for his friends, he sends them a present of a tablet beautifully wrought and decorated in colors, and the presentation is made an occasion for considerable show and display. On the front of the tablets, there are 3 or 4 large engraved characters expressing the praises of those being honored. To one side and below these characters is inscribed in smaller forms the name and the title of the magistrate who is honoring his friends, and on the other side is inscribed the date of the presentation. 2 of these lacquers were sent to Mission House, and with all the customary pomp and parade. One of them he wishes to have placed at the entrance to the chapel, which also served as the entrance to the house. The inscription on this one read, "The house of the scents from the flower." This second one, he asked to have placed in the reception room where friendly guests were received. And the inscription on that one was, "A holy people from the Occident." These tablets greatly increased the reputation of the fathers among all classes of the people. So you can see that's actually we call Chinese called bian, the placards. From the passages quoted above, we know that when the Western missionaries in China, they were impressed by that calligraphy was highly treasured and widely used on various occasions, and that their Chinese friends constantly sent them calligraphies as gifts. It would appear that most calligraphic works written for Western missionaries have not survived, yet a calligraphy album written by Wang Duo as a gift to the German Jesuit Johann Adam Shao Van Bell, his Chinese name Tang Luo Wang, is now in the collection of the Ye family, currently on display at the San Francisco Asian Art Museum. This is the album. Wang Duo passed his Jinshi exam in 1622, then pursued a successful political career. By 1638, he was already promoted to Vice Minister of Rites in Beijing, and then in 1640 to Minister of Rites in Nanjing. After the Manchus conquered China in 1644, Wang Duo collaborated with the new regime and was appointed Minister of Rites by the Qing court. Wang was also one of the most influential calligrapher of the later Ming, and his major artistic achievements lay in cursive script. Born into a noble family in Germany in 1591, Shao arrived mainland China in 1622. His learning and knowledge of astronomy soon made him an intimate friend of highly replaced scientists in China. In 1630, Shao was called on by the imperial court to serve in the Bureau of the Calendar. He went to Beijing. When the Manchus entered Beijing in 1644, Shao remained in Beijing and served the new dynasty. He was trusted by the Shen Zhou Emperor of the early Qing and was appointed director of the Bureau of Astronomy. The calligraphy album that Wang Duo wrote for Shao consists of two parts. The text of the first part is two groups of poems. Sorry, this is the image of Shao. This is the album. The first group was dedicated to Shao and titled, "While Visiting Mr. Tang Dao Wei," the Chinese courtesy name of Shao. We climbed to his pavilion and listened to his talk about various things overseas. In addition to these four poems, Wang Duo attached another four poems he had written before the fall of the Ming Dynasty that are unrelated to their recipient. The second part of this album is in clerical script. Its texts are two groups of poems Wang Duo wrote for a person named Yi Long. This part is dated to the spring of 1644, immediately prior to the collapse of the Ming Dynasty. This is another dating. This is Jiashen 2 月. That's the second month of the year of Jiashen, that is spring of 1644. So again, this part has nothing to do with the Shao. It is possible that the present album format arose when an early Qing collector mounted the pages of two unrelated albums as a single volume. My discussion of this album will be confined chiefly to the first part. The poems for Shao are not dated, but the two colophons are attached to these works. The first reads, "As I was writing this calligraphy, my two young boys are playing, chatting, and crying. It was noisy, and I accidentally omitted several words, like long, xing, wan, and he. How amusing! Calligraphy and painting should only be attempted deep in the mountains. How happy I would be if I could wield my brush among the waving branches of a pine forest and under the shadow of clouds. But how is this possible?" The second colophon reads, I'm sorry, what's wrong? Here. I'm sorry, it's here. Start from this part, 到位先生. Mr. Dao Wei's learning is like a celestial, nurturing many deep mysteries. He is like a dragon amidst the people. I wrote a scroll for him, but it was stolen. I thus write it again. I will have it mounted and then present it to atone for my earlier fault. I know Mr. Dao Wei will have a good laugh. The colophon is followed by an interesting passage. Actually here, last paragraph. For a month I have been sick, but I have to write to get food. So I did several pieces of calligraphy and sold them to get 5 dou of millet. I bought some ink. The ink is no good, but what can I do? The two colophons provoked much speculation as to the date of this work. Gao Wenlong in mainland China believes that it was written between 1641 to 1644 when Wang Duo had taken refuge in Henan and Jiangsu to avoid wars during his unsettled period of dynastic transition. The mention of his selling calligraphy to buy food and ink fits the character of this chaotic period. The Japanese collector Shen Zhou Murakami believes this album was written after 1644, namely the Manchu had entered Beijing, because it bears a seal. That seal here. I think the second here. That reads Yan Tan Yu Shou, that apparently was used by Wang Duo only after he turned 55 岁. But Murakami's analysis was based only on works available at the time. In more recent years, as additional works by Wang Duo have been published, scholars found that he used this seal before 55 岁. Huang Yinong, a Taiwanese scholar, and Alan Atkinson, who wrote his dissertation on Wang Duo, hold that the album for Shao was written after Wang Duo surrendered himself to the Qing government, because that time Shao was in Beijing, and later, in the later 1645, Wang Duo arrived there. So that's made it made it possible for Wang Duo to present his gift to Shao. But let me shorten my paper. But Huang's argument may have some flaws because we know that Wang Duo had 5 sons, of whom the last 2 were much younger than the others and were the only ones still young around 1643 and 1644 or 1645 when Wang Duo went to Beijing. And it is very likely that actually they died, according to Wang Duo's poems. They died. These 2 youngest sons died around 1643 and 1644. Thus, the young and noisy children mentioned in Wang Duo's colophon must have been his 2 youngest sons. So the colophon is likely, actually written before 1644. This is the date. But this dating has also some questions. Why would Wang Duo, write such an album during the Callic period if he was taking refuge in Jiangsu and Henan? Further, the places in which he took refuge were quite far from Beijing, where Shao worked. Now, who would deliver this scroll to Shao? For what purpose? So this is the question needs to be solved. So with I lead to believe that it was written before 1644. So now let me turn to the poems Wang Duo wrote for Tang Ruo Wang, for Shao. Wang and Shao probably met each other during the last years of the Ming Dynasty. That is to say, in the later 1630s and the early 1640s, when Wang Duo served as a vice minister of the rites. In the later Ming and the early years of the Qing, a number of early government officials wrote poems when they visited Shao's church. And almost without exception, their poems mentioned how much they were impressed by the telescopes and the clocks and the fountains and in their garden. Yes. Wang Duo was one of them. So in his poems, and he actually mentioned that he visited Shao and listened to Shao's discussion of the strange things from overseas. This is strange things. Strange things they used very often. Now let me briefly make a few comments on the quality of the calligraphy. As you have seen that Wang Duo wrote this calligraphy when he was actually in a very bad environment. His children are crying and very, very noisy, and he was short of money and bought a bad ink. So in terms of the artistic quality, I don't think this work is among the best works of Wang Duo. But in terms of its historical value, this work is very, very important. This is the only work we know a very famous calligrapher wrote for a very important missionary. So its historical value is very, very high. And also, this work, the second part of this work, is in clerical script. Wang Duo was one of the pioneers of the later Ming calligraphers who started the revival of clerical script writing. And he actually took the ancient Han style, Cao Quan style, as his model. And this revival led to the formation of the style school of Chinese calligraphy in the 18th century. So in this sense, actually, this album is historically important and artistically important too. Thank you very much.
I'll be changing roles, moving from the bad time cop to the position of discussant. And as I do so, if I could move temporarily to the role of advocate, I will keep my comments to 10 minutes, and I'll be a bad time cop on myself. But I think we have a tacit understanding that we could go as late as 1:40, since we started at 2:40, so we started at 1:10. So hopefully I want to try to leave some time for discussion of these very interesting presentations. What I would like to do is, in fact, to trace out some points of contact and unifying themes among these three papers by means of adding something that at first glance might seem totally unrelated. But I do think that when we talk about gathering and collecting, and calligraphy, we sort of can't avoid this monster that we have projected on the screen. No doubt most of you in this audience know what this is. This is the preface by Wang Duo to the Orchid Pavilion collection. So this is a preface to a group of poems that were composed in 353 in the Eastern Jin dynasty. So there's a gathering of literary figures composing poems. Wang Duo composes a preface to commemorate the occasion. And then, of course, as I'm sure most of this audience will know, this becomes, in a sense, the quintessential piece of calligraphy in the Chinese tradition. And what I would like to do is take as a point of departure, I want to talk about the mathematics of collection in a couple of connections. And I want to start out by talking about mathematics of time, since time has just been an issue for us in trying to fit all of this into the allotted time. But I want to begin by reading a passage. Oh, here. If you want to follow along, I'm going to read from right here. 夫人之享与佛养仪式. Okay. The opening, I'll just mention, gives the date and the occasion, talks about the weather and the environment and how lovely the occasion was. And this passage has something to do, I believe, that's quite important with the aesthetics, the time of aesthetics. As for the ways in which humans while away their lifetimes together in society, some take what they have directly from their hearts and speak it face to face in a single room, while some rely on external figures of their thoughts, roam freely beyond the bounds of physical form. Though there are myriad differences among inclinations, and though the quiet and the restless are unalike, at the moment when one delights in an encounter, and for a time gains satisfaction within one's mind, there is a happy self-sufficiency, and one does not know the coming of old age. So what we have here briefly, I think the opening, we have the aesthetic moment framed in opposition and in a complementary relation with the direct experience of conviviality. So we have gathering. Gathering is the primary mode of the aesthetic, and that these other mediated through text, mediated through art, these other modes are modified forms of a socially experienced, directly experienced aesthetic. That is, there's a notion of presence that's immediate, and then there are various kinds of immediacy that we can learn about culturally. Now, we go on in this passage into the sort of narrative of how the aesthetic moment happens, and it happens as a kind of escape from time. We ponder on the lovely moments of the season around us, and when we lose ourselves in the moment, we lose track of time. We connect. We lose track of the time of our own lifetimes. We forget the oncoming of old age. But of course, when we forget the oncoming of old age, we're mouthing the words of Confucius. We're expressing a timeless moment of a kind of cultural insight. And I think we can think about the multiplicities of time, multiplicities of occasion in many of the case studies that are presented, or the cases presented in the papers. We have the sequential occasion, the time, the incremental, repetitive time of Shen Zhou's falling flowers. Again, notice the late spring. The Orchid Pavilion is, of course, the ritual occasion is in the late spring, the lustration festival. So there's the atmosphere is one of the late spring, and the sense both of the loveliness and the fleetingness of nature. Of course, Shen Zhou with the falling flowers, and in this case, the calligraphic ongoing effort to commemorate, to reflect on the falling flowers, which happens sequentially through Shen Zhou and his disciples. We also have the more perhaps exceptional case of Yuan Mei's commemoration in a painting in a sense that really is outside time, in the sense it's creating something that doesn't happen in time. I think these are interesting moments to place together in thinking about these papers. Now we also have the question of the unities and multiplicities of process, another kind of mathematics. That is, on one hand, this is a record of a single event that's presented as having been very fulfilling and beautiful. And yet, the text itself multiplies into something that can't be pinned down into one version. And I think that what we can see here is a contrast between the notion of the fully formed artifact versus the notion of the creative and open process. And clearly we have a favoring of the latter over the former. And we can think about, in the opening passage, one of the things that we noticed in terms of medieval rhetoric is what we can think of as a kind of topos of accommodation, where we say, we're meeting here and it's fairly simple. We are enjoying the climate, we're enjoying the weather, we're drinking some wine together and chanting poetry. We don't have the full complement of musical performance, the things that are associated with really the, say, court events or the full-blown kind of entertainment of culture of that time. We're lacking these things, but it doesn't matter. This is what I would think of as a topos of accommodation. We can make do. And the making do becomes, of course, a privileged kind of moment. That is, making do means that you're not producing a finished artifact for consumption. You're producing something that actively engages an audience and addresses a community. And I think one of the most fun and fascinating ways to look at this in this piece is, of course, to look at this is very much discussed in discussions of this piece, but we see the way in which, and of course this is a copy of a copy of a copy, but we can still see this recopying of the multiplication of the text at the level of emendation. And the emendations in the text, if I can, this one, where the emendations flip-flops between present and past. And this emendation is, on the one hand, exactly the point he's saying, that the things that move us to this aesthetic delight, now, what about them? Well, they pass. And as we've completed that thought, we realize that the things we're reflecting on in the present are the same as the ones in the past. We can rephrase and say past. So the present and past there toggle almost as a sort of hypertext, to use our own kind of language, textual language. Perhaps the most exciting one here is this. You can actually make out the original text, which is, we've said that the way in which later readers will look at us is the same way that we look at those of the past. I think the text seems to be, the top one I think is you ke bei ye. That is, this also is worth being sad about. And what happens is that at a certain moment in the process that's represented dynamically in this text, we see almost in a very dynamic way, we see that surge of emotion where that's not strong enough. We go bei fu, we have the tone word after bei that becomes an exclamation. When the sadness that's being described and clinically and determined, saying this is something that one could be sad about, suddenly it does become sad in the moment. We emend and bei fu, and there's a power of the calligraphy and just the overwriting and the messiness, which I think is part of this kind of, again, a kind of openness of process that we see again in the layered contributions of the disciples in the Shen Zhou piece. So we see in all of the kinds of exchange and the dialogic, messy sorts of processes. For example, and I think this goes into a sort of more general notion of things like, for example, meeting with an elegant person, and rather than having the sorts of formal meal that one expects, having pizza. Or going and seeing, martial arts movies. Or, for example, I mean, I think that Professor Bai's commentary on the possible rationale for Wang Duo's mention of the hardship and the sort of tenuousness of his environment as he's writing out this calligraphy, I think that those specific speculations about motivation are very persuasive and interesting, but at the same time we could also think of this in terms of this a notion of elegance, which means exactly that amongst a certain kind of audience one need not tidy things up too much, that we could also think in these terms. Now, this leads, I hope, somewhat naturally to another area of the multiplicity, which is multiplicity of audience. And again, we remember that we have an aesthetic that's framed in terms of alternative ways of getting that sense of conviviality that we all have when like-minded people are together talking, drinking, and enjoying a party. We have the opposition in this passage here between those who get to talk face-to-face in the room and those who use figural traces for what they feel and think. And the phrase of 放浪形骸之外, that is, they they find freedom beyond the boundaries of form. This is a key phrase because it covers both the stylistic freedom of things like figuratively expressing oneself as a piece of willow floss in mud, and also includes the actual ethical kinds of what might appear to be foibles in the eyes of stern moralists, but in fact, when understood by the proper audience in the proper way, are also, in a sense, even though they're not text, they're figures. So I think this kind of connection between calligraphic style and ethical concerns is also something where we could productively put these papers together. And then finally, I would just mention, I think that the case of Yuan Mei's, the collection of the disciples is a fascinating case. And this also relates to Professor Bai's paper in the sense that we have this expansion of the audience beyond the frames that would be culturally allowed in a kind of earlier notion of a traditional culture. That is, we have women on the one hand, we have foreigners on the other hand, somehow being included in this kind of exchange, in this kind of process, which of course implicates us as modern people very much in our situation of ourselves vis-a-vis these traditions. But I also think specifically is just wonderful to be able to see the traces of this happening. Now the case of Yuan Mei seems somewhat problematic, and I think Professor Riegel has brought this out very nicely in mentioning the kind of fetishization of the disciples at the same time as he seems to be treating them very seriously. And I just wonder about this notion of the numbering and the collection. It seems as though, and one thing that came to my mind is that the 13, another way of thinking of the 13 is that 13 may equal 12 plus 1. In the sense that we have the 12 as being the collection of the Jingling Sha'ertai, and this obsessive notion of 12ness about the Meinyu in late Ming and early Qing culture, that in a sense Yuan may be playing around and saying, look, I've got 13. And there's a sense of almost a narcissistic kind of multiplication that's going on, where Yuan Mei, in a sense, by commemorating this kind of ideal society that's outside. We compare this again with the relation between Shen Zhou and his disciples, where they become actual co-writers along with him of the same thing. And it seems as though that what Yuan Mei is doing is perhaps slippery and different. I'm going to leave my comments at that, and hopefully we'll have some time, I think, for questions and comments from the audience. So thanks again to all of our presenters. A wonderful set of papers. Maybe that will work. We have the microphones.
Okay, I have a little information for Professor Riegel. This scroll actually very well published in early publications, Shen Zhou Boguangshe, the whole scroll. You can get very good image, and being reproduced by a modern scholar, Zhong Huiling, in her book, 清代女诗人. Okay, but I have two related thoughts, because I've been also working on the gathering, men and women, and Westlake. So I want to ask you whether you have thought of anything, why it seems the gathering also took place in Suzhou, right? So I know most prominence is with the Sun sisters, also in the location, in the Sun family estate by the lake. Mm-hmm. But whether Westlake, the water play any significance in this? And the other is related to the numbering, the 13s, and I think your argument is extremely convincing. But compared to other gathering, like the Xiyuan Yaji, is a later creation, right? And I don't remember how many members in it, the numbering, or the Lanting gathering. And I'm thinking of a lot of other gathering. Can you comment on this, or have you thought about any, of this others related subject?
Not really. As I'm sure you know very well, so much of what is said about these gatherings, so much of what is claimed about them is in a way a kind of fiction, a kind of fabrication, and so it's quite one isn't dealing so much with historical facts and historical situations, and I think so that I think finally that there are very interesting issues of numerology of the sort that Robert was alluding to at the end of his comments, and I think that those perceptions based on an understanding of numerology would perhaps help in a certain way, and I think quite purposefully, Xi Peilan in her poem, I think she's purposely complicating it even more. She's bringing into the scene additional references to 13, and so she's having a good time with that, and I think that's all part of the tradition. I think that with respect to the water imagery of Westlake, I think you're right. I think it's important to note that the very first scene that shows the Sun sisters walking under the willows, you can see that they're walking at the edge of the lake, and one can see the whole scene of the lake with the mountains with the mountains in the background, and that anchors the scene. And in terms of Xi Peilan's poem, that's why she begins the poem by referring to the paradise of Hangzhou that exists for her in a dream until she sees herself in the painting.
I have a question for Professor Bai Chen. First of all, thank you very much for your wonderful paper addressing what you call the historical significance of Wang Duo's album. But I just want to know more about his calligraphy. You briefly mentioned how he was indebted to the Eastern Han stele Cao Quanbei. But I think his semi-cursive script is far more significant than his clerical script. So I would just like you briefly comment on some of the aesthetics, like the Zhang Mo aesthetics in his calligraphy.
Wang Duo, of course, his best script was his cursive, as I mentioned, right? It's his cursive. There are three dissertations on his calligraphy, and focusing on his cursive one. So if you read, you can read that. His Zhang Mo, I wrote my book, in the Fushan's World. I discussed his Zhang Mo. The Zhang Mo, I think was inspired by two traditions. One was Dong Qichang, Xu Wei and Dong Qichang. And Xu Wei, constantly use this kind of, this kind of ink, very bleeding. And another possible influence was seal carving. So you know that during this period, seal carving became a new literary art, and many seal carvers imitated the Qin and Han seals, which were severely ruined by time. So that's it.
Just a couple of questions to different people. Bai Chen, I was wondering whether the Wang Duo's reference to having to work in bad conditions and these noisy children and so on couldn't be read metaphorically, and that it might not actually only refer to his own children. Jeffrey, I was wondering, the painter, the Xi Yuan Yaji was a very common pictorial subject in the 18th century, very, very popular, with strong conventions which are largely followed in this painting, but there are departures, I think. And in other words, the Sui Yuan, the picture you showed us is mediated by a pictorial tradition, and it might be useful to look at the departures. Now, separately from that, I wanted to ask you how the question of same-sex desire, Yuan Mei's reputed same-sex activities might have played into his played into the theme that you were discussing here.
You want to be more specific?
Well, in the sense that if one leaves it the way that you presented it, it might, you know, with the critiques of him as there's a sort of implication of that he's a dirty old man, and that what's in play is just straight desire, heterosexual desire. Whereas if one were to bring into play the possibility of same-sex desire being in play in his life, then his relationship to these women might be read rather differently.
You want to ask your next question? Or do you want me to answer?
Whether not Wang Duo use the sickness as metaphorically, right? Maybe, but I do not have sufficient evidence to make a further statement. But in my article on the 17th century use of sickness and disability, and in the body and the face, right? Edited by Wu Hong. I did mention that it is an interesting phenomenon that many artists during this period like to present their sickness to public, never hide it. Nothing wrong with the sick, but why you just, you know, to tell people what is supposed to be a very elegant work. But of course, you can trace this tradition to Song Dynasty. We have a scroll in Princeton, right? The Peter mentioned, right? The Huang Tingjian, right? Stomach problem. He in his colophon he mentioned. But of course, if you see Wang Xizhi's calligraphy, the letters, actually most of the letters survived by Wang Xizhi. Many of them actually are reporting the physical problems. So whether or not it's metaphorical, I need to study.
What about the ink itself, though?
What?
The ink on that album, is it poor quality ink? Can you tell?
I cannot tell, but he liked to use the so-called bleeding strokes. Sometimes you can see much serious than this one. But if he constantly uses the bleeding stroke, so we cannot interpret it as bad work by that one. This is a new aesthetic experiment, and initiated by Wang Duo, and then later actually followed by Fu Shan and others.
Can you still smell the fragrance of the ink?
Ask Mr. Ye. He played with this.
I'm going to, let me just respond briefly to Jonathan. First, thanks for the comments about comparing it with paintings of comparing this with paintings of the Xiyuan Yaji. I think you're right that looking at similarities and departures would be very interesting. I don't think there's too much doubt that the perception of Yuan Mei in the 18th century was such that he was seen as someone having sexual liaisons both with women and also same-sex liaisons. Zhang Xuecheng's attacks on him are for both. But a difference is that while he sometimes in his fiction, in his tales of the supernatural, there are stories that involve same-sex relations. While there are those stories, and it's clear that he has quite interesting views for his time. He uses these stories as a as a means of attacking, for example, Han Dynasty historians who were critical of the Han emperors, and he has a very good time insisting on revising the history. You know, so he's very much engaged in that. But I have the impression, and I haven't done enough reading on this, I have the impression, nevertheless, that while he writes about Hausa, he means largely desire for women in those essays, and he doesn't really talk in the same way about desire for men. I mean, maybe the essays are meant to cover both, but it's hard to say. And unless he does that, you know, unless he really engages that, and I think that I don't think one's going to find it in the literature. But I mean, unless he did that, then I'm not quite comfortable contextualizing in that fashion. In other words, looking at this in terms of the larger practices, in spite of the fact that as I said, he is certainly perceived that way in the 18th century.
I'm no longer the one to ask, I think. Maybe one or two? Yeah.
I'm just wondering if there's a larger umbrella for the term falling leaves, falling flowers. Because I've always been puzzled by the set of what's titled now the 12 Beauties. Actually, I think the Chinese title is Meiran, for Yang Zhong's series of 12 Beauties with all the elaborate things like furniture and literature and jade and antiquity that's painted in the painting of these 12 beauties. And also the faces of those beauties look very similar to what I could see on the paintings that Dr. Riegel put up for Yuan Mei's series of those beauties. There's a lot of similarities there. So I'm wondering if there's a bigger connection in terms of literature about beauties or 12 beauties or whatever.
Well, there's no doubt that the concept, the idea of falling flowers is intricately tied to feminine beauty. It's one of the themes that emerges in the poems very clearly, and has a tremendously long history in Chinese poetic writing. So I presume that's what you're pointing towards, is feminine beauty as the relationship with the falling flowers. There's no doubt about it. I mean, that's part of one of the layers of metaphors that goes into them.
Inspired by Robert's comment about time, it occurred to me that between the two panels, this morning's and this panel just now, that there seems to be a difference in terms of overall approach. This morning, the audience was invited to focus attention on the object itself as work of art. And in itself, as such, there is a capacity to escape from time, as Robert would put it. And then in this afternoon's presentation, we have a series of presentations, by and large, built upon the interpretive readings of the text. So, which inspire me, in fact, to wonder if if panel 2 were to think the way that panel 1 does, and vice versa, what sort of difference would it make in terms of what we might be able to get out of these objects or these texts?
Yeah, I think we can leave that as a comment.
Do we want to respond?
No, I think we should leave that as a comment.
Well, I think perhaps the best way of negotiating this would be to take this as a concluding comment, I think a very apt one to sum up the relation between the panels of the morning and afternoon. And in order to leave ourselves at least time to stretch our legs and have a little bit of a break before the following event, then why don't we once again thank our presenters on this afternoon's panel, and thank you all for coming.